with my colleague Dan about values. Now,
Yeah,
most people don't know that Dan's got a great pedigree in this topic. Um, I lose count of how many teams you've worked with, but I know one of the things that you bring to us as a growth specialist is your deep knowledge about how do you build a team, build a culture around you. In fact, you were the youngest store manager for Abercrombie and Finch
yeah.
ever. You had the biggest store, so you're really used to building up really high performing teams. So, Dan, I've worked in big businesses, I've worked in small businesses, and I always thought values were for just big businesses. So, what do we mean by values? And are they appropriate for, maybe a three-person accountancy firm?
They definitely are appropriate for a three-person accountancy firm, Heather, even for a one-person accountancy firm. So when we talk about values, we talk about the behaviours and standards that guide the way in which we do business. So they sum up what we stand for as a business, and they really drive the how and why we do things. They also influence organisational culture, and these values help us grow and evolve without losing focus on what's really important.
And so I think it's what you said there about it guides us.
Yeah,
And let me talk about why this is so important for small accountancy firms. And if we think about the journey of a small accountancy firm, it first of all starts with, hey, it's all about me. And you
yeah,
know what? My values become the values of the business. I can't divorce the two of them. And then you get a couple of people, and very often in that journey for that small accountancy firm, they're youngsters, they may be admin, they may be a trainee, and you're going to be with them a lot of the time, most of the time. So you're there all the time. So actually, you don't really need to have brought out into the open what are our values, what are our culture, because you're with them so much. Your personality drives that. Um, and thanks, Yasmin. I think this is the fact that you're enjoying it is all really positive already. So what happens though when you start to get beyond 5 or 6 is you can't be everywhere, can you? You can't get your personality to drive everything. And until you've really got agreement from your team members about what are our values, what is it that's important, what you're going to find is you're pulled into all the decision making because your employees don't have that moral compass to guide them.
exactly.
You often might get turnover because
Yeah,
people don't have that connection to the firm. 3, you can't trust the decision making often of
yeah,
employees. And actually by building out the values and getting people aligned to it, what I see is it gives people that, as you say, that moral compass, that unwritten rules of how do we act, how do we behave, and it drives that culture that
definitely.
will allow you to run your firm without you having to be present over every decision, everything that happens. But what do you see as important, Dan, for this sort of values?
I think exactly as you've just said, Heather, as your team's growing, there's so many factors that we need to consider. So, you look at your changes and what your goals are. You look at the changes in the KPIs that you start to focus on. You look at how you have to train and develop people, the coaching that you have to do, the constant badgering of questions that maybe you have to get asked, giving out feedback, carrying out reviews, having a look at the company culture and the environment as a whole, rolling out new initiatives. When you weigh it like that, it's almost endless the things that you have to do as your team's growing. So it can really impact on our time, our motivation, our focus, and we need to be able to adapt to these changes without losing our organizational vision and our company alignment. And that's where values really come into play. They keep us focused on that bigger picture and hold us accountable to our growth standards and ensure that we still achieve success in the face of adversity when times become difficult.
And yeah, and interestingly, a lot of our members and across not just in accountancy are facing this whole the great resignation. And interestingly, when we talk to our sister company, the Accountants Recruiters,
Yeah,
they are telling us that it's not about a lack of good candidates out there. There's
yeah,
actually a lot of people that are thinking of moving, but what they want to go to is a firm that has a good alignment with their values.
yeah.
They're trying to move away from what they would see as these stuffy, boring, have to be in the office 5 days a week type
Yeah,
environments. And this is another thing where values come in. You know, if you talked with your employees about what's important to them, why they come to work, these naturally come out in your value statements, which then permutate into how you work, which if you have a good alignment with the values of the type of people you want to employ. For example, you will have heard this, Dan, and I hear it a lot from our older members, that younger people, i.e. under 30, I've heard of as work shy, snowflakes.
Yeah.
And you know, working with you and some of our younger members of the team, I know this is anything but this is how selling values can help, because I know in our values we have a line like work hard, play hard.
Yeah.
You know, is there any link with sort of bringing those values to maybe readdress some of the preconceptions that people might have?
I think definitely. I think when you look at like, so let's say, for example, you take millennials, for example, like you said, there's a lot of times where people might say, oh, you know, this generation just wants everything for anything. Do you know what I mean? That comes up a lot, doesn't it? But no, it's not necessarily true. And it's how you can sort of like tie your values to entice those hard workers, and how you can entice those those people with those extra skill sets that you're looking for. And I think that's what's key in how you can market yourself to attract the right clients for your firm. And I think that's really interesting when you look at it like that.
Yeah, because I remember one of the reasons you joined us was because of the importance we as a company placed on self-care.
Exactly. Yeah. It was, for me, it was the ability to have flexibility within the role, but also know that I'm going to be learning and like developing a lot. So those were what I was seeking for within a role, was somewhere I knew I could progress my career, somewhere I was going to get personal development, and somewhere where I could have a little bit of that flexibility to not be overworked, but still be productive at my best. And that's why I chose to, you know, come and work with Exceedia, because it had everything that I was looking for.
You know, and it also had a charming founder. You missed that bit. Who looks a lot younger than her age. You missed that bit. Get on. But this is really important here, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here is, you know, and you're similar to a lot of people out there at the moment who are looking for a job and have 8, 9 interviews with different organizations. And actually, it was our values and how we brought that into life that helped A, encourage you in, and B, hopefully will keep you here for a lot longer. But let's stop patting me on the back, because we don't need to do this. And thanks, Becky. I love that different way of thinking. How can we market ourselves to entice the people we want? And this is so true. And by the way, if you've got a question for us or want to comment on this, do put something in the chat. I think we see some of it. We might not see all of it. But yeah, would love to hear from you. If you're enjoying this, press like. If you find it insightful, put a bit of a reaction. But you know, Dan, we're a coaching and education company. We're not an accountancy firm. So let's just say you have one of our members in front of you, and I know you're actually actively talking with our members about values and culture, because one of the things you bring to our business is that expertise about building up that team around you. So you're naturally working with the people that are 250 in terms of turnover and above, and culture, values, KPIs is such a hot topic, and it's your expertise. So how would you start to advise an owner that came to you and said, you know, how do we identify firm values? How do we make them real?
I think that's a good question. And I think it really depends on where they're at in their journey. So, you know, if they're at the beginning of their journey, it might just be themselves. And I'd say to start looking at, if you're at that part, start looking at your niche, you know, start looking at your client base and start to identify what values maybe tie in with your niche and your client base. So, for example, if you have a small client base, but, you know, you're going above and beyond expectations for them, and anything that you need, you cater to their needs, how can your values tie into that? Or if you're a very small team of like a family run business, how can your values influence that? So another point I'd look at is, how do you differ from other organizations, and can your values tie into that too? So, you know, how you market yourself is different to your competitors, and what gives you that competitive edge, I think, is really key to tie into your values too. And if you don't have employees, it's that question of, what employees would I want to hire? Where, you know, where we were saying about the recruitment aspects of stuff, it's that sort of piece of that will also help you identify where you want your firm to go and what values you want to carry your future vision of your firm. But later down the line, let's say your team starts to grow, I think it's really useful to start to get your team members involved in those values as well, because that'll really help, ingrain those values into everything that they do. So, interestingly, Heather, how did you come up with the Exceedia values?
So there was only 4 of us at the time. However, 2 of us happened to be real leadership organizational development experts. I mean, you're talking to one of them. And so we knew that it was important to start bringing this out, that, when it was just, say, me and Lisa in the team, we'd worked together for so long, we didn't need this stuff. But as soon as you start to multiply out, people want to feel attached to something. They want to feel as if they're part of something. And interestingly, in my work on how to make partner, we see that people that don't last long in a firm are the ones that tend to have the biggest mismatch between their values and the firm's values, or lack of values as often, because we have to remember that there's the publicized values and then there's the values that people live in reality. And very often there's a big difference with that. So we sat down, there were 4 of us, and we talked about what it was what we wanted from a job, what motivated us at work, what would switch us off at work. And we started to bring out a whole lot of phrases and words about how we wanted to be, what we felt was aspirational, what matched up with us, what were our own personal values. And we came out with a whole list of words. So we then started to cluster those words. And so we came up with, I think it was about 7 kind of key headings.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we did with those headings was broke them down into what that means. So one of our big values is do the right thing.
Yeah.
And for example, it's probably the value I invoke the most. So for example, when one of our team members was, in the Philippines, was very sadly impacted by a major typhoon in December, there was a whole lot of stuff that we did because it was the right thing to support her and her family through quite a difficult time. And so we apply that. Now, interestingly, we were 4 people back then. Of those 4 people, 2 people are still in the business, and we've got another 10 added in. So we're now going through a process of revisiting these and actually getting people to talk about, if I'm living this value, what behaviors will I see?
Yeah.
What sort of behaviors or decisions would actually be against these values? And so we actually we're going through that process as an organization, but also in our individual business units, because, the accountant's recruiter may have, they're a newer, funkier, more vibrant, type of, and, there's a question mark about, are these the right values for them?
Yeah.
So, we are looking at the lens, and it is a work in progress.
Yeah. That's interesting. I like that point. And I like the point of, how Exceedia will filter out into different places, and how are the values going to tie into those different fields of the organization as well, because each one's going to have different types of clients, and each one have different values that they need to tailor to those clients.
Yeah. And thank you, Paul. That's great to hear that. Golden insight, by the way. Dan, I think, the only way is down after your first LinkedIn Live. Mismatch of values plays such a big factor in why folk become disengaged and leave a firm or business despite having masses of talent. Yeah, absolutely, Paul. I completely agree with you. And interesting, when we've seen people leave our organization, it's either because there's a mismatch in, we are a remote organization. We have no plans to get an office, and sometimes people have left because they can't cope with that. But sometimes it's also because their purpose has changed. They might have signed up for when, we were going to grow and they really liked that idea. But then suddenly, 2 years, 3 years down the line, this going to grow and what it actually meant, they lost what was some of that importance that often it was about the connection to me that they lost. And we see that in small firms. Often those first couple of hires don't last when the firm starts to really grow, because often there's that mismatch in purpose and values, that things have now changed. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Paul. So now you're a big one for KPIs, Dan.
Yes.
You're a big
Love
one
a good
for KPIs.
target.
So you've recently been talking to a member about how to start to connect KPIs with his firm's values. What were you doing? Explain a bit.
So we were looking at his values, and he had, I've got them in front of me now here. He had 5 of them, and it was honesty, accountability, quality, teamwork, and happiness. And it's interesting when you look at those values, you probably think, how am I going to link these values to KPIs? Honesty being probably one of the tougher ones to think, how am I going to link it to every single KPI? But it's interesting when you actually sit down and start to review, you'll find that they do just tie into them naturally in some sort of way. So, for example, we looked at honesty and how that ties into monthly recurring revenue. So, and how that's mediated by our skills, for example. So, when we look at honesty, we're looking at open and honest communication, trust and respect, and admitting to mistakes. So, that being mediated by skills, we look at our communication, our empathy. So, if we look at repricing as a topic and how we carry out our repricing with our clients, we look at what's the best way to do this. How can we emphasize with our clients, but how can we communicate the message across to them that in an honest way that they understand why we're carrying out our repricing? And, if that message comes across correctly and in the right way, let's say they increase their fees slightly, then that's going to impact positively on monthly recurring revenue. So that's just one example of how honesty might tie into that specific KPI. We'll look at another and talk about accountability being another one. So holding ourselves accountable to our performance. So, we look at time management, planning, organization, and taking initiative as a sort of like mediating factor between that and, let's say, the KPI being percentage of personal tax returns filed per month. So completing those tax returns. So we look at how are we holding ourselves accountable to making sure that gets done, how are we managing our time, how are we planning and organizing, and ideally completing the right amount of personal tax returns filed at the end of the month. So that would be another example for accountability. I'll just have a look at one more. So if you look at teamwork as one as well, so collaborating, sharing our successes, our problems, our ideas, and our thoughts together, and the impact that might have on a business development KPI of, let's say, generating a number of new leads per month. So skills being problem solving that mediate that. So it's that sort of like collaboration with each other. And it might be an idea of, okay, I know this person's really good at prospecting the new leads, and I know this person's really good at having those conversations and really converting those into proper leads. So how do we get the team to collaborate with each other? So is it a case of them working together to share the strengths and the opportunities with each other to make each other more well-rounded, to impact positively on that end number of new leads each month? And that's how we link the KPIs to them. It's a very simple but yet very effective, and tie into sort of like our how we reaffirm these values as well. So we can do this with feedback measures, one-to-ones, performance reviews, because the more we're exposed to these values, the more it will become a natural part of our daily work and our self-awareness. And, if you're really struggling with a topic or a KPI that you're working on, once you get the values ingrained into you, you might take a minute to just reflect and think, okay, so how am I holding myself accountable to reaching this? Or how am I looking into my quality and having a look at how am I being detail orientated? How am I not making mistakes? Or how can I seek continuous improvement? And it's that reflective piece what is really important when we look at our values as well.
Yeah, because you're absolutely right. What often happens, and it happens in the big firms too, is we identify the values, they're on the documents, they're on the mug, and then we don't do anything with it. And it becomes, leadership codswallop. I'm picking my words very carefully. And I think this is really important, is it's not just about identifying it, as you say, it's about bringing it into every single thing you do in your firm. So, for example, one of the things we do is any new recruits, we send them the values document and say, look, this is who we are. This is what you're going to be signing up for. If it isn't right for you, good luck type stuff. Do you bring that out so, for example, one of our things is there's something about always learning, always challenging.
Yeah.
And I know when I first started to work with Donna, who heads up the accountants recruiter before she joined us within the business, she was like, wow, you're doing all these things differently, but this is amazing. Can I nick this for other people?
Yes.
And these are rocket science. But one of the things as you've seen, Dan, is before your final interview with me, you got a little video from me.
Yeah,
Just
I did.
customize it. People don't normally do that. And that's an example of us always learning, always challenging. And we know it makes a real difference. So it is, as you say, bring it into your recruitment, bring it into your interview questions,
Yeah.
show it to people, talk about it in their induction with you. How does this actually materialize? Bring it into your, quarterly reviews.
Yeah.
Bring it into that whole KPIs of, if we're going to deliver on this, these are the values we as a company really need to pull into. So, Dan, we said at the beginning, this was how to tell if your firm values are hampering your growth. So let's just pick out some of the summary of what we've talked about so that people can tell. Well, I think the first thing is, if you don't have them and you've got more than 2 people, you're hampering your growth.
Yeah. Exactly.
What else would you say is how to tell if your firm values are hampering your growth?
I'd have a look at, that piece about what do you stand for as an organization, and what message are you hoping to give to your clients? What message are you hoping to market yourself to other people? How are you setting yourself apart from a competitor? And are your values in line with that? So let's say, for example, if your values is, let's say you work with a small client base, but you're very, very detail orientated and you want everything to be very specific and very perfect for your clients, then one of the values that you probably want to look at is the quality of your work. And if you had a value, let's say, for example, I've seen it before in the past where there has been a value where it's been about excess output. So get as much done as quickly as we can. And with that value, you wouldn't want to have that value if you're detail orientated, for example. So having the opposite value can really hamper your growth as well. And that's something to assess is, how do these values impact on my performance, on my KPIs, on the recruitment side and everything? And are they in line with that? Do they influence positively on that? And I think that's the main point as well, because if they contradict, then it's going to hamper your growth.
And I think there's a really good point that you picked up, is when we're growing a small accountancy practice, it's a lot of change. It's initiative after new project. And I think if you find it really hard to introduce initiatives, if you find it really hard to adapt how team members are working, you've got a cultural issue. If you have a cultural issue, it's normally linked to an absence of values that are being lived. And I would start, when you find it hard to do that sort of thing, you need to go back to your values. When you've got a cultural issue, and when I say cultural issue, here are some of the examples I've heard from our members where they know they've had a cultural issue where they don't get into the office until 10 because they need to do the school run. But the rest of their team members are meant to be there at 9. But when they rung the office, there's nobody there at 9, and somebody's been, one of the team's been picking them up, but they've all been getting to the office at 9:30, but they haven't been working half an hour later. And it's these little things, or what often maybe hits in December, January, where there's we need to all pull together, and someone's like, no, I'm not doing any extra time. I'm sorry, I've got things to do in my plan. There's often that normally says there's a problem with values. If there's a problem with culture, it always links to a problem with values. And I think that's the really important thing. So, Dan, do you want to give any closing remarks?
I'd just like to say, if you haven't got values, then get them. That would be my favourite, just to end on. Or have a little think about how, if you have them, maybe ask yourself a question: are these values in line with what we want to achieve in our company vision? Because your vision is always changing as time goes on and as your team grows. So I think that's a question that you probably need to ask yourself as well: is do my values need a sort of like sprucing up or a rethinking, or do I need to involved in this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And if any of this resonated with you and you're thinking, I'm struggling with the growth of my small accountancy practice, Dan can be contacted very easily. Ask to connect with him on LinkedIn is a good start, or Daniel at Exceedia.co.uk. He's a great person to work with you if your practice, if you're getting to that point where you've got more than maybe 3, 4, 5 people and you're finding it hard to push that from around about a turnover of about 250 to 500,000. Dan, this is his sweet spot, knowing how to really decode and build that culture underpinned by the values that's going to drive growth. So thank you very much, everyone. If you've enjoyed this live, please comment, please put a reaction. We'd love to hear how you found it, and speak soon.
Thanks, everyone.